Hello everybody, we'll just wait a minute or so just to let people join. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning everyone, and you're all welcome to today's teacher webinar on stress management and self-care. My name is Amanda McCardle and I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm project manager for Walk in My Shoes, and if you're not aware of Walk in My Shoes, it is an awareness and education campaign of St. Patrick's Mental Health Services in Dublin. I'm very excited to be hosting this session today because it's actually our very first webinar for Walk in My Shoes and St. Patrick's. So we're delighted that we have you, some school staff and teachers, as our audience for our very first webinar. So we just want to start off by saying we recognise just how stressful the last few months have been on teachers and school staff. So we just want to say thank you so much for what you do. You're doing a fantastic job. And that we hope by attending this webinar today, you'll get some useful information in relation to how you can best manage stress and your own mental health. So I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, starting with Debbie Van Tonder, who is a cognitive psychotherapist and Programme Manager for St. Patrick's Mental Health Services, Dean Clinics and Adolescent Service. And today Debbie is going to share ways in which we can better manage stress. Our second speaker of the day is Louise O'Leary, who is a trained occupational therapist and advocacy manager with St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. And Louise is going to talk about the importance of self-care. So just before I hand over the mic to Debbie, I have a few different housekeeping items that I just want to draw your attention to, just about the platform and the presentations in general. So in order for us to track you here today, the audience, we just require you to put your name into the Q&A box on the right hand side of your screen. So if you look to the right hand side, you should see a little Q&A tab. If you click on that, just type in your first name and your surname and enter. And no one else will see this information, just the event organisers. And that way we can track you in order for us to send you an email after the webinar with a recording of it and also your attendance certificate. So it's really important that you type your name into that Q&A box so we can track you. So we'd love to hear from you today during the presentations. If you have any questions at all at any point for either Debbie or Louise, just type your question into that same box, into the Q&A box, type your question in there. And if we don't get to the question during the webinar, we will absolutely follow up afterwards. So you'll definitely get a response to it. But just we're conscious that a lot of questions might come in and we have such a short space of time, but we will try our best to get to all the questions. And if you're tweeting during the event today, don't forget to use our hashtag, which is #TeacherSelfCare. And then, of course, you can tag us at Walk on My Shoes. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. So Debbie, if you'd like to turn on your mic there, you can get started.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Amanda. And this is quite an interesting venture for me. This is my first webinar and it is quite stressful. So it really links in quite well with our topic for today. So you're all very welcome, and I hope you find today's talk helpful, and if you have any questions, as Amanda said, please feel free to ask them. So my name is Debbie Van Tonder, and I'm a cognitive behaviour psychotherapist and a program manager at St. Pat's, as Amanda have said, and I have a real interest in cognitive behavior therapy, and it is really about the thoughts and what we, it's really about the way we think and the impact it has on our emotions and the way we cope. And this is quite pertinent to the way we manage stress as well. So if we sorry, there we go. I need to figure out all the little buttons here. So my agenda for today really is I want to do a very short introduction to stress. And the reason for that is because Louise and I are really piggybacking on each other, and she's going to look a little bit about the way we manage stress as well. So I want to introduce stress, and I want to look at work stress during the pandemic, and then the impact stress has on our thoughts. And the thoughts are really like wild horses. So really using that analogy and seeing how can we actually tame the wild horses, our thoughts have become wild horses, because they can be quite wild and uncontained and can have quite a negative emotional impact. So if we look at stress, I think what happens in mental health care, and I think what happens in the modern life, is stress becomes such a buzzword, and it becomes a word that we get quite blasé with, and it's something that we all know about. But when we actually really stop and pause, we realize that there's so much more going on with stress, and it really has a negative impact on our lives in whole if we don't actually look after the way we deal with stress and managing our stress. So stress is really anything that can trigger our fight and flight response. And fight and flight response really is, a heart beating fast, getting a bit breathless, feeling anxious, and just feeling quite tight and feeling quite stressed. And I think when you use the word stress, everybody knows what it is really. But it's really quite interesting that stress can have a positive impact, and it's really important to remember that we all have a functional level that we can cope with stress. So everybody has a level of stress that they can cope with in a very, in a very functional way. And we all need a little bit of stress to perform quite well. And so it can have a positive impact. So it can motivate us to perform better. So, for example, preparing for an exam, or perhaps for an interview or something like that. But chronic and enduring stress over longer periods is usually detrimental. So, for example, COVID-19 is an unprecedented level of stress that we've been going through for the last number of months, and it can have a detrimental effect on us, especially if we don't manage it and if we actually don't contain it in a way. So when we look at work stress during the pandemic, and this is quite interesting because this is something I've experienced, and I'm sure my colleagues as well, because all of us had to work through the pandemic, had to change the way we work, and had to change the way we shop and change the way we live, really. And it's really important to remember that we're not isolated. This is not something that's just belongs to us. This is something that's actually across the world, and everybody is in the same situation. And of course, it doesn't minimize the stress. It just means that we can almost understand it from a more global level, that we're all really on the same spot. We all understand what everybody's going through. And it's unprecedented stressful times. It's triggered panic buying and panic working. And this is really important because there's a sense that there's high pressure to produce and a high level of performance anxiety. And also, certainly, from a personal point of view, I've experienced this where I felt that I have to be in the office at a specific time for a specific period of time, and a high level of anxiety to make sure that that I do my job really well. And it's just that sense of insecurity, really, and uncertainty that's come with COVID-19. And we've worked harder and longer to give the illusion of control, because we feel in control and we actually feel that our work is in control, then we perhaps feel that we can control the world, which of course we can't. So it prevents us from feeling powerless and scared, but it increases anxiety triggering thoughts. And that's really what I want to focus on, because we forget the power of thoughts, and that's something really that I have a special interest in. So our thoughts become like wild horses, like literally runaway horses. And what I want to do is just look a little bit at how we can pull it back and control it. So we have what we call the perpetual vicious cycle of thinking, and it's called the 5 systems. Now, this is an example of somebody that experiences a little bit of social anxiety. So when they go into social situations, they might get nervous. But it's a really good example of how our thoughts impact our emotions, our body, and our behavior. So just imagine going into an important meeting, and even today with the webinar, there's a tad of a little bit of social anxiety for me, having to put myself out there, don't know who you are, and to have to like literally be observed by potentially hundreds of people out there. So it's very anxiety provoking. So the thoughts that could be triggered, and it's really looking at ourselves like a triangle almost. So our head is our thoughts have an impact on how we feel, so on our heart, and then it interferes and influences what we do. So it's always important to remember what happens in my head influences my heart and influences my behavior. So it's really the thoughts of, I'm going to make a mess of things. What if I forget what to say? I'm going to make a fool of myself. It's very common, isn't it? And then the emotions about being nervous, edgy, scared, leads to the physical response. And this is where we know that we have the fight and flight response, is that heart pounding, the sweating, the blushing, trembling. All of that really tells us that now our fight and flight response have been triggered. And then that really leads to avoidance, perhaps drinking too much water, controlling the breath, and all the behaviors that we do to feel a little bit safer. So, but the key around this is it starts with the thoughts. It starts the way we think about it. And we call this the like wild horse thinking. So these are what we call negative automatic thoughts. And all of us have these negative automatic thoughts. Every single one of us sometimes will, well, not sometimes, a lot of times will potentially catastrophize. And exactly the thoughts that we've just looked at is, for example, what if I forget to say? It's a prediction, isn't it? I'm going to make a fool of myself is catastrophizing. I'm going to make a mess of things is also prediction, catastrophizing. But some of the worst thinking styles that we could have is potentially the worry and the rumination. And the worry and rumination are very closely linked to each other. And worry is really, really a wild horse that we must tame. So how do we tame the wild horses? So what can we do to help us to feel a little bit more in control of our thoughts? So if you look at that 5 systems model that we've used in the two slides ago, we identify the negative automatic thought. So go back to that slide here and say, well, I'm going to make a mess of things. That is a negative automatic thought. What if I forget to say? Those type of thoughts are the ones that we need to identify, and then be realistic. And the most easiest way to do that is to ask yourself, is this true? And often I ask myself, am I predicting? Am I mind reading? But if you ask yourself, is this true? Then it often brings in the realistic reality orientation. So arm yourself with evidence-based information. So for example, is this a fact? And what is my evidence to support that? So instead of looking at an opinion, which is emotionally laden and full of anxiety and all of that, look at what the fact says. So, and then identify fair, balanced thoughts about the situation. So find a healthier alternative thought. A healthier alternative thought doesn't mean that it's from bad to good. It just means that, yes, I am anxious. This is a stressful situation. Everybody is in it, but what can I do to make sure that I control my environment, my situation? And in that sense, you doing a problem solving, you taking actions to improve what is happening instead of just thinking about it. So the thinking and worry is often like an old lady sitting in a rocking chair, lots of movement, but it goes nowhere. So it's really about pulling it back and saying, what can I actively do to solve this problem if it is a problem, and if it isn't a problem, letting it go. Really a good way to identify thoughts is to write it down. So exactly like the little 5 systems model I've showed you there, write it down, write down what's happening in your head, and then you'll be able to see, often when we write it down, it's like, this doesn't make sense, and then you can bring it back and you can look at it from a healthier perspective. So you can ask yourself then, what is on the other side of the coin? As best you can, don't ruminate. Ruminate is a very unhealthy thinking cycle, and it's the one where we think and think and think and think and think, and often in circles, and it brings us nowhere, but it actually can have a real negative emotional impact. So worry is the horse that must be tamed. And although all of us worry at this stage, perhaps about family, and as teachers, perhaps about children that you're not sure how they're doing, and maybe about children that might be worrying about family that's at high risk or anything like that, worry is an exceptionally unhealthy thinking pattern, and it can really, really lead to children and ourselves feeling quite down and depressed. So best way to deal with worry is to be aware of the fact, this is a worry going around and around and around in my head. So to be aware of the worry, interrupt the worry, and then again, as I said earlier on, write it down. The minute we write down the thought, it helps us to achieve perspective, refocus and redirect the awareness then. So look at what is the other side of the coin. is this just a worry? Is there anything I can do about this? And if not, refocus the attention to something else that is perhaps more proactive or healthier. And the question to ask yourself when you have this worry is, how is this thought helping me? So often with worry, there's a sense that worrying is going to bring me a solution, or going to show that I care, or help me to plan and prepare. But what it really is doing is just keep going around and around in a never-ending circle. So it is asking yourself, how is this thought helping you? And then again, is this true? And is this really, really true? And what could be a healthier way to cope with it? So if worry is, maybe the thought is, worry shows me that I care, could you perhaps maybe, instead of worrying, perhaps send somebody a text or a phone call and see, well, is that a better way to show that you care instead of having it all in your head? Okay, so I'm going to, this is my last slide. So goodness me, the time really flew past, didn't it? I'm going to, Amanda's going to, or Tamara is going to ask, see if there's any questions. But Louise is going to share some very good resources at the end of her presentation that you could explore if you want to. And one of the resources that I use quite a lot, often is the Centre for Clinical Intervention, who has a lot of resources around stress and anxiety and all of those things. And of course, the St. Pat's website that Louise has got the link at the end of her presentation. So I'm going to take my slide off the screen while we're going to wait for any questions. I've just muted myself as well there.
Me too. As I said, it's our first webinar, so do bear with us. Debbie, that was fantastic, and I really hope teachers and school staff can take something from that. Just before I call out 3 questions that have come in from our attendees, I just want to remind our attendees that if you require a link to the recording of this webinar or an attendance certificate, you have to type your name into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you just look over there, this is for any latecomers, so it's just a reminder, type in your first name and your surname and enter, and it just means we can track you on this platform. And then we'll follow up afterwards with a link to the recording of this webinar and your attendance certificate. So first name, surname in the Q&A bar. Okay, so Debbie, I'm going to call out the 3 questions. Some of them are a little kind of long or a little bit detailed, but if you want me to repeat it when you're going to answer it, just ask and I'll repeat. So the first one is stress linked to anxiety and panic attacks? The second question is it a good idea to allow students to know that you're a little stressed out, or should you hide it from your students? It's a really good question. And question 3 is, do you know of any studies carried out in relation to teacher wellbeing in Ireland? I'm starting a master's in September and would like to research wellbeing in the school environment. So if you'd like to go ahead and start answering those, Debbie, and if there's one you want me to repeat, just ask.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And that's very interesting questions. I'll start with question 3. No, I don't, I'm sorry. But I think it is really good to actually even go to Google Scholar or something and even Googling it, and you will be finding some literature on it if any research has been done. I'm convinced that there potentially would have been quite a lot of research about teacher wellbeing. So it is something to maybe go and look at, you know, some of the academic websites. I don't know, to be honest. Question number 1 is stress linked to anxiety and panic attacks? And there's a yes and a no about that. Experiencing stress and having stressful situations is not necessarily a cause for anxiety and panic attacks. The real cause for anxiety and panic attacks could be stresses, but usually a perception of risk and a perception of danger. So, for example, and it's not necessarily realistic danger. So it is often a thought, and it is often due to classical conditioning and the way we condition to certain situations. So if somebody maybe have been in a lift before and they got really nervous or the lift got stuck, that is probably a trigger for a panic attack in the future. So it's not necessarily a stressful situation per se. So maybe the question is the stress about COVID-19 a reason why somebody could be having anxieties and panic attacks? It could potentially be, but it will depend on what the person is predicting in their mind. So what are the thoughts that is around the stress of COVID-19 and so on? So if there is a prediction of a parent or a sibling or a granny or somebody maybe getting sick and dying or getting sick and really suffering, that could potentially trigger anxiety and potentially trigger panic attacks. Panic attacks are normally linked to a fear of something bad happening to our body. So it's what we call a catastrophic prediction around a physical sensation. So if somebody's fight and flight response is triggered and their heart's beating very fast, they might have a thought that, oh my word, I'm going to have a heart attack. And that is very much linked to panic. So if somebody is perhaps having a headache or they feel a bit fluey and the thought is, say, I'm going to die of COVID-19, yes, it could potentially trigger a panic attack. And then it is really about looking at the thought, and that is the catastrophizing I was talking about. So that catastrophic thought about a physical sensation could trigger panic attacks. Stress and enduring stress could potentially cause more of a worry problem rather than a panic attack. Now, worry is also an anxiety disorder. Remember, we have quite a few anxiety disorders. So worry is also an anxiety disorder, and stress and enduring stress could certainly cause a worry disorder and for a person to worry and worry all the time. And that is why I specifically wanted to call that worry and rumination, because that could certainly be triggered by stress. The second question was, is it a good idea for a student to know that the teacher is stressed out? Yes and no. So, and I'll qualify that. So, yes would mean it's not a bad idea to share and for people to see that we are also stressed out. I've shared it myself in the beginning of the talk, where I said even doing the webinar is anxiety provoking and it's a little bit stressful, because it's normal, and stress is normal and anxiety is normal and feeling stressed out is normal. But there's a point where self-disclosure can become unhealthy. So it is really about showing what is the reason why I'm sharing it. Is it to show perhaps the students that we're all feeling the same stresses, we're all experiencing this as stress, and the stress is normal. So in a way, it's to normalize the stress and normalize anxiety. Absolutely, that's fine. But if it is about maybe overstepping that little bit of boundary where it becomes to get support from the students and for them to say, oh, it's the oversharing bit, perhaps that could be unhealthy. And that is about saying it's really being aware of how much do we share and how much not. I think it's quite fine to normalize stress and to say we're all feeling it, but not normalizing it to the extent that we're minimizing it. All of us experience stress in a different way. And it's important to say that maybe for us, something that's not stressful at all could be highly stressful for someone else. So it's fine to say, actually, I'm also feeling stressed out. I also get nervous. I also get anxious. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I would say to that question. I don't know if there's any other questions anybody would like to ask, or I will hand over back to Amanda.
There was actually, Debbie, sorry to cut you off, there was actually loads of questions, and as I said, if we couldn't get to them, we'll follow up afterwards. However, I don't want to move on without answering this one, because I do think all of the teachers would like to hear this response, if that's okay. So a teacher asked a question, can you give us any advice to help with negative self-talk about not managing the new way of working for us teachers?
Oh gosh. Oh, that is, do we have enough time in the day to answer that question, really? Negative self-talk is really one of the wild horses that is there all the time, and is about it's self-critical, and we become our biggest enemy by using negative self-talk. it erodes our self-confidence, doesn't it, when we start beating ourselves up? And because our brain doesn't know if the words that we use are coming from inside our head or outside our head. It doesn't know it's an internal self-talk. It doesn't know to filter it and to actually say that this is quite unfair and quite harsh. So it really takes it to heart, and it can have a real negative impact on the way we feel about ourselves. So what I would say is it's exactly the same thing as the worry is becoming aware of the negative self-talk and write it down, and again asking yourself, is this fair, is this realistic, and is it true, and is it an opinion or is it a fact, and finding the other side of the coin. So negative is giving out about saying to ourselves, finding it difficult to work in this new way. We're all finding it difficult to work. It's very difficult. It's very stressful. It's really acknowledging that. All of us, we had to go from within 2 weeks from doing full face-to-face clinical sessions to doing it all remotely. It's exceptionally stressful and it's not easy to do. And it's really, really important to acknowledge that. And once we can acknowledge that, is to say, it's okay to finding it hard, because it's not the normal way we worked, and it's not, we social beings, we like to interact with people. We don't like to sit in an office alone and talk to a screen. But it's about saying, you are doing the best you can at this moment in time by following the national health guidelines, by making sure you are safe, your students are safe, and your family is safe. That is the most important thing. And it is about saying this is not your choice, but this is your obligation to make sure that you can still deliver your service, you can still deliver your teaching, you can still show people that you care, but doing it in a really responsible way and still in a very supportive way. So it is really about bringing in that self-compassion and being really kind to yourself, and to say, of course it's hard to do this. It's not about saying, well, it's easy. It's absolutely not easy. But it is then saying it is really hard, and instead of beating yourself up for struggling, is to really commend yourself for the fact that you are making an effort and you're still providing a very, very valuable service to your students and to your employer. Yeah.
Thanks a million, Debbie. That was fantastic. And I'm sorry I threw in a sneaky question for her. But,
sorry, did you hear that answer?
Yes, yeah, we did. We did. Thanks a million. So just before we move on to Louise O'Leary, another gentle reminder, I can see we have a few latecomers coming in. So just if you want a link to the recording of this webinar and you would like an attendance certificate, please insert your name, your first name and your surname into the Q&A tab. But if you have already done this, that's fine. You don't need to do it twice. Just a little gentle reminder. So we will move on to Louise O'Leary for her presentation. Louise, if you'd like to turn on your mic, please.
Hey, can you hear me? Yep. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning. I'm going to share with you some ways to think about and approach self-care and minding your mental health at present, and in particular thinking about those things in relation to work. And I know a question has come in about ways to manage stress beyond breathing exercises. So hopefully you'll get some ideas from this presentation. So we'll get started. So just to start, I'd like to draw your attention to the background image on our first slide here, which you'll recognise if you can make it out as an image from an illustration from an airplane safety card. And it's demonstrating the principle of securing your own oxygen mask first before attempting to secure the oxygen mask of a child or someone else in your care. And that principle really holds true for minding your mental health and self-care as well. In order to support people we're perhaps caring for or responsible for in relation to our work, or indeed in our personal lives, in order to do that in a sustainable way, we need to make sure that we're also tending to our own mental health and self-care needs first. So just to bear that in mind as we go through the slides. And that's really backed up by research in the case of teachers, which shows that the mental health and well-being of teachers can influence the mental health and well-being of pupils. Okay, so what is self-care? What do we mean by it? Well, in simple terms, self-care can be thought of as any activity or behavior that we engage in that's directed towards meeting our needs as human beings, and that supports our health and well-being, mental and physical. That idea of needs is something we'll come back to. But we know that there are many challenges in day-to-day life, and as Debbie has explained and given examples of in recent months especially, there's many ways that our ability to meet our needs can be challenged. I've listed out some there, and I'm not going to talk through all of them, but a couple I wanted to highlight that might be particularly relevant or worth thinking about. The first is workload, and from a study in the UK of over 1,500 school staff on well-being, workload and work-life balance was by far the most commonly identified factor that impacted stress and happiness levels. And I know there's a question in about studies in Ireland about teacher wellbeing. I'm not aware of specific ones in Ireland, but I can share at the end perhaps the references to a couple of UK studies that have been carried out in recent years. Another one that I wanted to just highlight at the moment in the context of recent months is the area of role demands. And when we think about the different demands that many of us have been juggling in recent months, it's easy to understand how perhaps our needs may not be met fully in relation to self-care and looking after our mental health. So, for example, many of you who may be a parent to a child or children have been juggling work and full-time childcare. You may also have been giving extra support, practical or otherwise, to relatives cocooning who wouldn't have required that support previously, or you may be providing extra care and support for loved ones who were receiving formal care supports that have now been interrupted because of the pandemic. And we know these things are taking a toll on people's well-being, in particular women's well-being, because it is studies around the world have shown that the extra demands are falling to a greater degree on women. Men are obviously experiencing them too, but there's a bit of a discrepancy there. And the last thing I wanted to highlight, just in case people aren't familiar with the term, is the concept of vicarious trauma. I've included that because I'm conscious that some of you attending this morning may have experience with disclosure of or proximity to a trauma involving a pupil or a student. What vicarious trauma means, it refers to the emotional distress or impact on a person that a person can experience from being exposed to another person's trauma. For example, if you're supporting students through a school tragedy, perhaps. And that's something that can really have an impact on our mental health if we don't tend to it and get support. So I just wanted to flag it, I suppose, as an issue that might be of relevance. So coming back to that idea of needs, which is fundamental really to the whole idea of self-care, I wanted to draw attention to this psychological theory, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, or perhaps many of you. And that's by an American psychologist who developed it in the 20th century. It's called the hierarchy of needs. And the idea with this theory is that as human beings, we strive to meet our needs and to progress up through different levels of needs in order to fully realise our potential as human beings, a state that's called self-actualization. And I remember in college when they were teaching us about this, they said that not everybody reaches that level, and I think they gave the example of the Dalai Lama and that kind of people, or those kind of people. So don't worry if you're not self-actualized, just to put that out there. But the idea, another important concept in this theory, is that it's harder to progress up the hierarchy if our lower level needs are not being met. So if we look at the level of physiological needs, that things like the basic needs we have as human beings for air, food, water and health, and we might think that those things are taken care of in daily life. But if you take a step back and you think of a very stressful day where perhaps those wild horses that Debbie was referring to are running rampant in your mind, and you've got lots of different things you're juggling with, You might skip a meal. You might reach for more coffee instead of water. And those things have an effect on how we feel and our ability to manage the stresses and strains of the day. Moving up to the next level then of safety, the need for safety, shelter, stability, the need to feel secure. Again, thinking of recent months, tasks that would have been perhaps very stress-free for most of us previously now have a level of threat embedded in them. If you think of going to the supermarket, and I certainly have experienced that fight or flight that Debbie was talking to at the peak of the lockdown, where I was getting really irritable and stressed and my heart was racing sometimes in the supermarket. So even that level of safety and stress, safety I should say, apologies, can sometimes be impacted, and certainly probably has been for many of us. So if we're not tending to that, if we're not addressing our thought patterns, if we're not finding ways to relax and balance out stress, then it's much harder to progress up to other levels of our needs, such as social needs, the needs for relationships, intimacy, social life, and then what's described as ego level needs, which is developing our potential, our interests and our skills. So again, it's just another way of thinking about self-care and checking in with yourself. And I know these slides will be available if you want to. Sometimes it's helpful as a reference to look back at these things. Another helpful way of looking at the whole idea of minding our mental health, and really links back to many of Debbie's points, is the bucket model of stress and resilience. Debbie's already flagged how stress can actually be a functional part of life. A really good example at the minute that comes to mind is going back to that supermarket example. I feel a little bit of stress going to the supermarket now, and I've started wearing a mask. So that stress is helping me to follow public guidelines. And then when I'm in the supermarket, that irritability that was there before is gone. So it has it can have a functional purpose at a certain level, but it's cumulative, as Debbie pointed out. And when stress increases and builds and builds and builds unabated, it can cause health problems, both mental health and physical health problems. We all have different responses and levels, but what's really common to all of us is that we need to make efforts to keep things balanced. And this bucket idea is a way to think of that balance and what's going to help us to sustain that. So the bucket represents our tolerance, our capacity for stress. It'll never be fully empty. It might be at that nice relaxed level. You can see there when we're on holiday, I'm sure I know we're all daydreaming about going on holiday safely again in the future. So when we do get there, hopefully we'll have a nice low bucket of stress and feel relaxed. But in day-to-day life, a normal level is sort of where it's half full. You can see from the image there, though, that the bucket often gets filled up with different things, different stressors. And looking through some of the examples there, and again, thinking of recent months, dealing with change, job problems or challenges, anxiety, worries about family, lack of sleep, maybe health anxiety or worries. A lot of those things may have been at play for many of us over recent months. So for many of us, we may be experiencing a heavier bucket of stress in recent months. The other side of the model, though, is resilience, our ability to cope with the stresses and strains of work, of life, I beg your pardon. A key way of doing that is to incorporate pressure valves, release systems into our lives. And some of the examples there are rest and relaxation, talking to trusted people, doing something you enjoy, and good time management. And I'm going to expand on some of those things as we go on and give you some other ideas. But I think this is a really helpful image and way of visualizing stress and resilience, because it really brings into play that sense of balance, and also figuring out what's right for us, what works for us to keep things in balance. Sorry. Bringing it now to yourself, what I'd like you to do for this last bit is to think about your own individual situations, and thinking about the fit in particular in relation to work between yourself, the work you do, and the environment you do it in. And this is a model called the person environment occupation model that we use a lot in occupational therapy. And the idea is that when there's a good fit between those three things, it supports our participation in daily life, and it also supports mental health and well-being. And this is very true when we think of work. Mental health and well-being at work is influenced by the interaction between the person, the work we do, and the environment we do it in. So what I'm going to do in the next slide is look at some questions to kind of pose yourself to see if there's potential for a better fit. But first, I think it's important to recognise that this model, this system, has been impacted in recent months for many of us. So the person represents you in the circle. I know we're not all women here today, but I hope people will accept a teaching icon, Miss Honey from Matilda, as the image to represent you. The work environment then, prior to the outbreak of coronavirus, I'm presuming most of you, I'm guessing most of you worked in a school. So a purpose-built environment for the job you're intending to do. Just to note, the environment isn't just the built environment, it's also the culture we work in. What are the policies, what are the norms? How is mental health approached as a topic in your school for staff and students? It also includes the social environment, the relationships we have with our colleagues, with our line manager, and with the people we're working with, in your case, students. But in recent months, that's had a dramatic change, and your work environment may look something more like this at the moment or recently. And then moving on to the occupation, the nature of the job you do, it may have looked like something like this image for at least a large part of the day. So you're in the same room, the same space as the young people you're working with. You have a degree of control over what's going on. You have the resources and tools you need. And again, the nature of the work you're doing has changed dramatically, and it may look more like this now. So there's a space, literally and probably metaphorically, between you and the students you're teaching. There's a lot of things out of your control now. It's mediated by technology. So I suppose it's important to acknowledge that things have changed, that fit is not optimal at the moment. And you know, that's happened for so many of us. So just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, that I'm very aware of the limitations of suggesting some of these changes. But it doesn't mean that there might be some potential for a better fit in terms of approaching your work life and thinking about what works best for you in terms of managing stress and looking after your mental health and well-being day to day. So these are just some questions I'd like you to reflect on for yourself. When we think of that person part of the system, that first circle, that includes things like your skills, your abilities and needs, your experiences and preferences, your values. So helpful things to ask you are what's right for you as a person, what helps you to feel energized, and what helps you to concentrate during the day. So that might be sensory preferences you have, bringing certain smells or plants or things into your workspace. It might be about needing movement before you settle down to the day, doing a brief yoga video or a walk of the block before you settle down. It might be about getting up and stretching in between classes. Thinking about your peak time during the day is important as well. So when are you at your best? And you know, we all have an ebb and flow to how we function during the day. And we all have different task demands during the day, some of which are easier for us and some of which are more challenging. So is there a way that you can adapt your day and your tasks to fit you better? Thinking about the nature of the job you do then, that relates to the demands and nature of the tasks at hand, the tools and resources required to do the job. Do you have what you need to do the tasks expected of you? How are things scheduled? Is there a degree of autonomy? Is there wiggle room there to change things? Is there potential to do things differently? I mean, for many of us, there's probably been a lot of trial and error in approaching our jobs and our work days in this new normal. So is there potential to do things differently? If you've tried certain things and they're not working out, is there scope to change? And I think a really important question to ask is what can you control and what is beyond your control? Going back to that image of the teacher facing the screen, you know, there's lots of things in that scenario that aren't in the control of the teacher in that image. The technology could fail. A student could turn off their laptop and, you know, say that I'm not, sorry, I'm impugning students here, but, you know, there may or may not have been a technological issue. So there are things that we can control and there's things we can't control, and I think acknowledging that is really important at the moment, and sort of being compassionate with yourself in that regard. In terms of the environment then, as I mentioned, that includes the built environment, the physical environment, but also the culture and things like the social support available to you. I just wanted to make a note on your workspace setup as well. There was a working at home wellbeing survey completed in the UK in the first weeks of the lockdown there, with around 500 respondents. And one of the biggest findings was that over half reported new musculoskeletal complaints and new aches and pains, which is directly linked to how people's workspace is set up. And obviously our physical and mental well-being is really interlinked. So looking at your workspace, is it ergonomic? Is it a good fit? And I'm saying that being mindful that people might be, you know, in wardrobes effectively doing their work, or, you know, trying to find a space on the kitchen table, for example. Another thing to think about is what other spaces, excuse me, can you use to take breaks, whether that's in the house or outside. Green areas in particular are really important and have been found to be really valuable to lowering our stress levels and managing work stress in particular. So that might mean just sitting out in the garden and taking a few deep breaths if you're lucky to have a garden, or it might be using your lunch break to go to the nearest park or green space. How responsive is your school to feedback and suggestions? And I guess the environment piece of this system is not always in our control, but if there is scope, if you have ideas or things that aren't working, is there potential to flag that and raise that? And a really important question in relation to your self-care and mental health needs is to think about what support is available to you if you need it, informal or formal. So another outcome of this move to working from home will have been a disruption of the normal social contacts we have and the normal social relationships we have during the course of our workday, which really can serve to support our mental health and well-being, whether it's debriefing after a difficult class or just having some humour and laugh and happiness with your colleagues. And that's been interrupted massively for so many of us. So are there ways to reconnect with that? I'm conscious many people will be going on summer holidays now, but in terms of maintaining those links in that rapport, is there ways to arrange virtual coffee breaks, for example? And that's something we've been doing in our department and that we really value. Is there ways to just, you know, arrange phone calls with valued colleagues? And then being aware of your formal supports, what's available to you. Is there employee assistance programs, for example, that knowing that they're available can be helpful for when you need them? And just to take a step away from work and to think about just mental health in daily life, I think it's really important to acknowledge that what's been happening in the world is not normal. But what is normal is that many of us will experience anxiety and worry from time to time. You may not feel as productive as you usually would. Your sleep may be disturbed or have been disturbed. And those things are normal. It's normal for us to have experienced some impact on our mental well-being day to day. And it's really key that we all make special efforts to look after ourselves. And it goes back to that very first image I showed at the beginning. If we're looking after ourselves, we're in a much stronger position to then look after others when they need it. So thinking about the basics for you, your sleep routine, trying, you know, a lot of us will have found our sleep's been disturbed, so really trying to keep the same waking and going to bed hours, even things like dimming the lights, having a wind down hour before you go to sleep can really help. Reading a book, a literal physical book, turning off your phone an hour before you go to bed, or at least not looking at it, making sure to eat regularly, and trying to get out of the house for exercise as best you can. Leisure and social life again have been interrupted, and a message that has been repeated through all the public health messaging is staying connected, the importance of staying connected in whatever way you're most comfortable with. I know we've been talking a lot My friends and colleagues and I have been talking a lot about sort of feelings of anxiety about the lockdowns lifting that some of us are having, and maybe simultaneously a pressure to do things we don't feel ready to do yet. But what's really key is staying connected, whatever way that's most comfortable for you, whether that's going for a walk with a friend or sticking with the video calls or going somewhere at a quieter time, whatever works for you. The important thing is to stay connected. And I think another important thing is to try and connect with pleasure in your day, opportunities to restore and relax. So recognizing that some of us just might need more rest and downtime lately to deal with everything that's going on. And a final point I want to make is about the importance of keeping informed. Just going back to what Debbie was saying there, a lot of our thoughts, anxious and worried thoughts, aren't necessarily rooted in fact or good evidence. And what is helpful is to keep informed about situations that are going on. There's lots of good information out there about obviously coronavirus, but also about minding yourself and your mental health. What's key is that that information is from reliable sources and that the amount of information we're seeking is manageable. So not falling into the trap of scrolling for hours and hours and using social media for your information sources. We know from research that's been done in recent months that that does not help our mental health and well-being. And then finally, I just wanted to draw your attention to some information sources that are out there that might be helpful. The Department of Education and Skills, in case you're not aware, I'm sure many of you are, have developed information and resources on teacher wellbeing and self-care during COVID-19 school closures. And that link, there's links, apologies, all the writing in green are embedded links. So when these slides are sent out by Amanda, you'll be able to click into them and it will bring you to the relevant website. And the Teacher Wellbeing and Self-Care webpage includes links to other resources and sources of support. The general information then for the public, support information on wellbeing during COVID-19, has lots of good information for yourself and also for family and friends that might be relevant to you at gov.ie/together. NEPS has provided or prepared a range of advice and resources for keeping children and young people well during COVID-19. There's broad information that's there all the time pre-COVID on supports and wellbeing for teachers on the Teaching Council website. And then if you have queries or concerns or would like more information specifically to do with mental health issues, there's lots of information on the stpatricks.ie website, including a range of blogs and resources in relation to minding your mental health during the pandemic. We also have a support and information line, 01249 3333, with a callback facility out of hours. The HSE mental health information line, 1800 111 888, will provide you with information on services in your local area, and there's lots of information and links on the yourmentalhealth.ie website. I know there was a question about breathing exercises and other things you can try. Hopefully I've given you some ideas in this presentation, but there's also a really useful website that the psychology department in Beaumont Hospital developed, which has really accessible information about relaxation, breathing and mindfulness, introductory information with brief exercises you can do and stream for free. And just a reminder for anybody that's worried about their mental health or about the mental health of a family member, that your GP is often your first best point of contact if you're worried about your mental health. So thanks for listening. I'll pass back to Amanda now.
Thanks a million, Louise. That was really fantastic. And again, just like Debbie's presentation, we hope school staff and teachers can take something valuable from that. So we've had a few questions come in, and I've just pulled out 2 or 3, if that's okay, if I can go ahead and ask you. But I think maybe my questions might have got lost in the first round when I was asking Debbie. So I'll just ask you a question, and if you'd like to answer it, then I'll ask the next question. Is that okay? So the first question, the first question is, how do I deal with concerns surrounding going back into the classroom in the autumn? You're just muted there, Louise, sorry. Concerns
from personal concerns, do you think it means?
Yes, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that's about sort of I guess returning to normal life, and that perhaps speaks to what I was mentioning earlier around some of the anxieties. Certainly, I know I've been experiencing them, and I've been talking it through with colleagues and friends as lockdowns are lifting. So I'm interpreting it that way. It's that return to maybe normal life when coronavirus hasn't yet been eliminated, but the risk is lower. What I would suggest, sort of plugging my own work here, but we have a blog on stpatricks.ie about minding your mental health as lockdowns lift, which talks about the idea of re-entry anxiety, that return to normal life, and some of the anxiety that can bring. And there's two reasons people can experience that. One is worry about the virus itself and risks linked to that, and the second is social anxiety, which I know Debbie spoke about in more detail. That idea for maybe some of us who experience social anxiety or who may just be more introverted by nature, that return to the social demands can prove anxiety provoking. So there's lots of tips and advice on that blog page. We could maybe send a link to that out when we're circulating the slides. That might be helpful.
Brilliant, thanks Louise. The second question is, when I get stressed, I find it really hard to keep up my self-care routine, so meditation and journaling. Any help on how to maintain a routine during stressful times?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those catch-22s, isn't it? When at the times when we most need to be tending to ourselves and our mental health and our self-care, they tend to fall by the wayside. I mean, you can get very I think an approach that might work for teachers, who perhaps is a stereotype, but I imagine teachers as very organised and to have a really highly developed time management skills and things like that. Something that can help is making an appointment with yourself. So by doing that, you're sort of elevating the importance of it, you're prioritising it, and being sort of proactive about it, like setting a reminder on your phone, putting it into your calendar, and picking something specific that feels achievable. So if your mind is racing, you're not able to settle down to meditation, maybe it's having an extra long hot bath, or lighting candles. Finding ways to kind of weave it into your day can be helpful. And I think reminding yourself of self-care as something that's necessary and essential. It's not extra. So its importance needs to be elevated at those times when we're stressed. I hope that's of some help.
Thanks, Louise. And the last question we have is it actually important to get 7 or 8 hours sleep a night? And is it important to get to bed before midnight?
So the amount, I think, for adults, Debbie might know this as well. If I'm wrong, she can come in. But 7 to 8 hours is the sort of general recommendation for adults. As we get older, it kind of comes down. So I think sort of late in midlife, we kind of lose an hour a decade, I think. And then for teenagers, they need sort of 10 hours. They need more than that. So yeah, 7 to 8 hours is the optimum. If you lose sleep on 1 or 2 nights, that's not harmful. But if you're chronically losing sleep, it can impact your well-being. It can have health repercussions in the longer term. You don't want to get in the trap, though, of worrying too much about what time you're falling asleep at. I'm not asleep yet, because that can create anxiety and stress. Sort of taking sort of like a gently passive approach and trying out if you're struggling with sleep, trying out some of the things like the wind down hour, stopping using your phone, reducing caffeine, dimming lights in the evening, listening to things like sleep sounds can help. So things like waves or relaxing music. Thinking about your sleep environment. Don't think about work. Your sleep environment, is it dark enough? Using an eye mask if you need to. Lavender oils, things like that before you go to bed. All those things can help. So trying out those things if you're struggling with sleep, and trying not to focus too much on how many hours am I getting can sometimes help. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it can help. But yeah, 7 to 8 hours is ideal. Going to bed before 12, I guess it depends on what time you need to get up at, really, and what your sleep routine is like. So yeah, so kind of working backwards, I guess, when ideally you'd like to be getting up at, and figuring that out. For some people, getting to bed maybe an hour or half an hour before they hope to fall asleep can be helpful, so that they can unwind further, you know, have a lamp on and read a few pages of a book, for example, or listen to a meditation or a mindfulness or slow down podcast or something like that can help.
Brilliant, thanks Louise. And I think Debbie might want to jump in there. I think you have some advice you'd like to touch on that as well, Debbie. And just unmute your mic. Brilliant.
There we go. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think it's really quite dependent on the individual. Some people might need 9 hours sleep to have a really, you know, good quality sleep. Other people might get away with 6. It really depends on yourself. But what is important is the quality of sleep. So if you do find that you are sleeping 6 or 7 hours at night, and you wake up really tired and you're not functioning at your optimal level, then you potentially could not be getting enough sleep. So as we get older, we need less and less sleep, you know, less and less hours of sleep, but we still need the quality of sleep. So what I would suggest is exactly what Louise has said, is looking after sleep hygiene, making sure your bedroom is used for sleep only, looking at the temperature of the room, you know, all of those really practical things. And then if you do find that you're tired in the morning, make sure you perhaps go to bed in half an hour earlier and another half an hour earlier until you feel rested. And that is the key. So if you feel rested after 6 hours of sleep, then that's potentially enough for you. If you feel tired after 6 hours of sleep, then you potentially need more sleep. I'm quite a purist when it comes to sleep hygiene. I think going to bed before midnight is healthy, especially if you are struggling, especially if you are anxious, especially maybe if you might be low or anything like that. But again, as I say, it all depends on the person. I know personally, if I go to bed after midnight and I still wake up my normal time, I'm really exhausted. I think an hour before midnight is a good time. But then again, depending on, as Louise said, what time you need to get up and so on. So it really is a personal thing. But the most important thing is 10 hours of sleep. People might feel that they need more and more sleep. You don't necessarily need more sleep. You just need more better quality sleep.
I was just going to come back as well to, I realised I promised I would mention 2 studies. There was a question about studies on teacher wellbeing in Ireland, and I hadn't come across any when I was preparing this, but I did see 2 very good pieces of research that might be of interest to the person who asked that question. One was by NHS Scotland. It was an evidence review on supporting teachers' mental health and well-being. So I can add an extra slide perhaps to my slides, and then it will have the link in it. But it's supporting teachers' mental health and well-being, an evidence review from 2020, and another one was from 2018 by the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families, another UK study. And their report that came out of that was 10 steps towards school staff well-being, and there's a link to that in the NHS Scotland study that with some other references as well that hopefully will be of interest.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Louise. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our webinar. I want to say a huge thank you to Louise and Debbie, our presenters today, for sharing their presentations. We really hope you did find it useful. So as mentioned, we couldn't get to all the questions, but we will follow up afterwards. I will send an email probably early next week with your attendance certificate if you would put your name in the Q&A tab, and also a link to the recording of this webinar. As I mentioned, it's our first webinar, so we did include a feedback survey link in the Q&A tab. If you look there now, you should see it. But we'd really appreciate if you could take a minute to fill it in. There's only 5 really short questions, but we would appreciate your feedback. So thank you in advance for doing that. And for further information on all things Walkham Issues or St Patrick's Mental Health Services, for useful resources or news on upcoming events such as our upcoming webinars, you can visit walkhamissues.ie. And of course, as I said, I am project manager for Walk On My Shoes, so it'll be myself anyway that you would be contacting in Walk On My Shoes, and I'd be happy to get back to anybody with any advice or any news. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful summer. So take care.